Hello, people. We are group number 6. We are Lucia, Mayra, Marco, Sandra, and me, Marisa. Today, we are going to talk about social linguistics and education. Before we start, I would like to give you a short definition of social linguistics in order to understand better what social linguistics is. We can define it as the branch of science that analyzes the relationship between language and society on the basis of its use in diverse social contexts. We use language in order to build relationships. The first time we met a person, we always make speculations on the basis of spoken language. For example, we can infer the geographical region the person comes from or what social class he or she belongs to. Are there any variety of languages? Of course there are, but linguists does not consider any of those varieties one better than the other. There is a standard variety and a non-standard variety of language. It is considered that using a standard variety is better in a social sense. Why? Because those people who use that language will increase the opportunities in work and education, while those who use a non-standard language tend to produce the opposite effect. Bernstein, for example, regards language as something which both influences culture and is in turn influenced by culture. He believes that there is a direct and also reciprocal relationship between a particular kind of social structure and the way people in that structure use language. And as a result, that way of communication is handed down from generation to generation. He also mentions two varieties of language in society: elaborated code and restricted code. The first variety, elaborated code, is the one where people use a complex grammatical structure when elaborating a sentence, while the second variety, restricted code, is all the contrary. People who use this variety of language employs short, grammatically simple, and often unfinished sentences. We use language for many purposes. For example, to tell other people about our ideas, wishes, needs, experiences, etc. But also, during a conversation, we begin to draw inferences about the person we hear. For example, about his or her gender, social background, friendliness, ethnic origin, and whether or not he or she has a good intention. As we could realize from the very beginning, there are many varieties of languages. Linguists, for example, use the term vernacular to refer to the language a person grows up with and uses in everyday life in ordinary social interactions. So, what is the difference between language and dialect? Hogan says that the word language is used to refer either to a single linguistic norm or to a group of related norms, and dialect is used to refer to one of the norms. It is important to mention that the dialect in French or dialect in German cannot be used in connection with a standard language. So, in German, to tell someone they speak a dialect means they do not speak standard German. Hagen also mentions that speakers of English have tried to use both language and dialect. Dialect is used for both local varieties of English, for example, Yorkshire dialect, and for various types of informal lower class or rural speech. The term dialect often implies non-standard or even substandard. This is part of what we call the standard language ideology.
Now I will talk about difference but not deficit in language. Many linguists believe that language should not be an issue at all in education. They claim that all varieties of language are equal and say that we should teach everyone to be tolerant and accepting of other varieties. The reality is that people do use language to discriminate in every sense of that word. Milroy and Milroy, in his work, state that what happens is that although public discrimination on the ground of race, religion, and social class can no longer be done, it appears that discrimination on linguistic grounds is perfectly acceptable, even though linguistic differences may themselves be associated with ethnic, religion, and class differences. Varieties of a language do exist, and people do use these varieties of their own purpose. The role of home dialect and ways of using language is found in the work of Heath. She studies practices surrounding literacy in the homes of people in 3 different communities in California, USA, which she gives the pseudonyms the first Tracton, the second Roadville, and the last one and third one, Maintown. Now I will mention some important characteristics about Tracton. Tracton is a black working class and farming community. Talking about education, children are not systematically exposed to books and printed materials. They are not socialized to sit and listen quietly while adults tell stories. Storytelling is often a collaborative event. Children are not asked to label things in books or to answer questions about the story. When they get to school, they have behavioral problems. Some important characteristic of Roadville is that the community is made up of white working people. They have a similar orientation to being read to, and in terms of behavior, children are taught to sit quietly and listen and answer questions about the books. However, stories they create themselves are not encouraged and in some cases are treated as lies. Most importantly, they can talk about the plot of story, but they do not have experience in discontextualizing it and integrating it into their own lives. Children of Roadville are less prepared to do more advanced work. Maytown is a community made up of middle-class people. Children are raised in this tradition in learning to participate in literacy activities that are parallel to what they will encounter when they begin school. That is to say, they have a school-oriented education. Children interact with books at preschool level. Children's education includes behavioral aspects such as being careful with books and sitting quietly while an adult reads aloud, and also in ways of using language such as labeling pictures in books, answering questions about what happens in a story, and using allusions to characters and plot from books. The only children who have a background that corresponds with what is done in school are children with Maintown upbringing. Now we will talk about the role of home dialect education. Siegel points out multiple problems with forbidding the home language of children. These include the social, cognitive, and psychological disadvantages of being told that one's way of speaking is wrong and undesired in a school context. This leads to children struggling with identity issues surrounding their heritages, insecurities about expressing themselves in front of the teacher and classmates, and the difficulty to acquire literacy skills. Siegel goes on to outline 3 different ways in which the home dialect of the children can be incorporated into instruction. For example, in instrumental program, the language is used for instruction. In accommodation program, the language is used for particular tasks such as creative writing or oral expression to be carried out in the home language. In awareness programs include accommodation activities but also involve explicit learning about different varieties of the language, and the social process through one language dialect becomes the standard. Also include a contrastive component in which students learn about the rule-governed nature of all dialects and contrast the rules and patterns of their own variety with the standards. Such programs require recognition of the legitimacy of home dialects. If teacher and administration do not wish to legitimate the dialect, it cannot be used in the classroom. It is possible for both to legitimate the dialect and teach standard, but this requires an ideological stance which allows for pluralism and acknowledges linguistic inequality. There is also a pedagogical issue because many educators believe that immersion in language or dialect to be used in education, that is the standard, is the best way for children to learn variety. However, research does not support this view. Moreover, denying the legitimacy of children's home language may have a serious negative impact in terms of both social and psychological development.
Now we'll be dealing with debunking myths about African American vernacular English and education. Have you ever pondered the consequences of the myths around non-standard varieties on the speakers? Does education play a role in these consequences? Well, in the US, African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, has been widely misunderstood, and it's had several consequences. As regards educators, many viewed some characteristics of AAVE as deficiencies. It was considered restrictive cognitive development when compared to standard English. In the late 60s, educators were expected to supply AAVE speaking children with a language, based on the belief that they suffered verbal deprivation or had no language. Black children were taught how to speak the standard variety. By 1972, Labov critically called this the myth of verbal deprivation. As it turns out, AAVE is systematic in itself and also related systematically to the standard. It just happens to be different from the standard educators favor. Black children's linguistic ability has too often been measured based on their poor performance at certain tests, despite the skills being as good as any other children's. Any fair test of linguistic ability shows this. As Labov poses, the asymmetrical position of a black child tested by an adult white interviewer explains why the child will avoid saying anything at all. AAVE speaking children's verbal skills are just different from those valued by many teachers. The kind of compensation they may actually need is some guidance on the use of language in education. But this is not only a problem for Black children. Language plays a central part of a process of indoctrination. It is one of schooling's major functions, indoctrinating working class children in middle class ways. The term achievement gap is often used to refer to the low academic achievement. In 2002, Green showed that in inner city schools, the proportion of African Americans reading below the level was 2/3 for 4th graders and more than 2/5 in the 12th grade. White students' rates, on the other hand, were 29% for 4th graders and 17% in the 12th grade. Now, how do we deal with non-standard varieties in the classroom? Well, I hate to disappoint you, but the issue remains unsettled. Let's point out that one of the purposes of education is the achievement of social equality. Educators' attitude towards this is that AAVE limits its speakers socially rather than cognitively. The speakers, though, resent attempts to devalue their varieties. The varieties are very highly valued for in-group interaction and the construction of social identities. Some important issues involving race, language, and classroom practices have been addressed. This is what happened at the Ann Harper decision in 1979. The 11 parents of African American children sued the school board for denying their children the equal opportunity when learning to read due to the variety they spoke. The judge ordered the board to take appropriate action to teach the children to read, even if it meant teaching in their own variety. Children shouldn't have to adjust to the school, but the other way around. Then in 1996, the Oakland School Board in California decided to recognize, maintain, and use Ebonics in the classroom. They declared it to descend from African language, which they referred to as genetically based, to which the Linguistic Society of America unanimously adhered less than a month later. This caused resistance both from prominent African Americans and white conservatives, and such furor that the board finally dropped the word Ebonics. Linguists may not provide any solutions to problems associated with widespread misleading views about African Americans' linguistic ability. EdelL offers no specific solution, but claims that both varieties must find some kind of balance. Blake and Cutler point to the importance of language ideologies in educational settings. They found that even when teachers recognize AAVE students to face ESL problems, very few support programs that use AAVE as a tool to teach standard English. What is in it for teachers? Some sociolinguistics, out of the many who have been advocating for speakers of non-standard varieties, have further applied the findings to education. Wolfram, who has managed to develop a state-approved dialect curriculum used in North Carolina state schools, argues that sociolinguistics should be compelled to consider the applications of the work to be part of their career obligations. Sipo suggests including more sociolinguistics in teacher training so that knowledge will break the boundaries of linguistics and applied linguistics.
The topic on multilingual education has to do with language ideologies which inform educational programs, teacher practices, and student participation. The issues involved here are the legitimation of home languages of children, the social identities that are related to these languages, and the issues of exactly how the home language might be used in the classroom. Minority language is the language spoken by a minority population of a territory. Of course, there is an anti-bilingual program, and high-stake testing have a negative effect on minority language speaking children. For example, the use of standardized tests to evaluate students' achievement and teacher effectiveness. A research by Wright and Boogie in 2007 addresses the social and psychological advantages of programs which support ideologies of plurality and the value of the minority languages spoken by the children in the classroom. Children could get high self-esteem if their home language is legitimized in an educational setting. Classroom solidarity also plays a very important role in lessening the conceptualization of a speaker of other languages and/or members of other ethnic groups. The use of minority language by a teacher can enhance the development of friendships. Slide. The use of minority languages in the classroom. There has been a long prejudice against the use of this minority language in the classroom. The reasons against this is that the most effective way to learn a second dialect or language is complete immersion. Some research has not supported this view. Immersing children in the target language is not the most effective means of teaching them that language. A very well-known report by Ramirez, the result of an 8-year study over 2,300 Spanish-speaking children from more than 500 classrooms, ranging from kindergarten to 6th grade in 5 different states, found out that the more years of bilingual education children have, the better they perform on English standardized tests in 6th grade. So we could recognize there in this kind of programs the long-term effectiveness. The schooling in Spanish do better on tests in English. Another research, for example, Thomas and Collier, show similar results in this kind of programs. The most successful bilingual program are two-way immersion programs. It consists on instruction in their dominant language and exposing them to English through Anglophone peers. Such programs have social and psychological advantages which contribute to academic success. In this case, the students are less likely to drop out of school, they have higher long-term academic achievement, and show more positive attitudes towards school. Another ideological issue has to do with the status. The status of minority language, that it does not command a great deal of respect. In this case, elite and immigrant bilingualism. Immigrant bilingualism is usually low status. Immigrant languages are associated with poor segments of society. There are stigmatized identities. On the other hand, elite bilingualism means speaking two languages which both carry high status. In many countries, speaking an international language such as English, in addition to the national language, creates elite bilingualism. The distinction between elite and immigrant bilingualism is not a linguistic difference. The perceived difference is cultural. On the one hand, it is low status to speak a minority language natively, but on the other hand, it is high status to learn a second language.
Education and worldwide English. Among the most common issues in classrooms around the world arise whether minority languages should be used and how they should be incorporated into the instruction. So, I will make emphasis on how these issues emerge when learning English as a global language is part of the educational context. Tan and Tan observed students who live in an environment where their goal was to learn standard English, but they also were exposed to Singapore English. He focused on student attitudes towards Singapore English and standard English to find out which was the best pedagogical practice. The results from the longitudinal case study showed that the students appreciated the value of standard English, but that they didn't feel that Singapore English is a bad English. However, the use of Singapore English is very dependent on context and interlocutors. For instance, Singapore English is considered inappropriate from an English teacher, but less so from a math teacher. Okay, now let's talk about the circles in English. But first, let's look at some basic concepts in the study of global Englishes before focusing on social, linguistic, and political differences between education in context with non-standard dialects and minority languages, and those in which English is a global or local variety with prestige as an international language. Cattrew introduced a set of terms for describing the role of English in different countries across the globe. We have the inner circle that refers to regions in which English is used for almost all functions by the majority of the population. For example, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia. Then we have the outer circle that alludes to countries in which there are originally non-native but institutional uses of English. For instance, the Philippines or South Africa. And finally, we have the expanded circle that comprises countries in which English is learned as a foreign language and in which plays an important role in economic development. For example, China and Denmark. Elite closure. Language often reproduces social inequalities as only certain people have access to languages. This access allows them to participate in more prestigious segments of society in which there are often higher economic rewards. The concept of elite closure has been used to describe how people with power use language to reproduce their privileged positions. Myers-Cotton defines elite closure as a type of social mobilization strategy by which people maintain their power and privileges via linguistic choices. Myers applied this concept in her work in Africa, in which colonial languages such as French, Portuguese, and English are spoken by a minority of the population. Also, she notices that elite closure is present everywhere. However, it's more apparent and stronger in cases in which a distinct colonial language contrasts with local languages, and relatively small percentage of the population has mastery of the colonial language. Then we have Bright, who discusses the historical situation of the status of English in South Africa. He concludes that there is a little challenge to English in its role in economic development, but also that the local languages will continue to be spoken. Also, Reid notes that the varying levels of exposure to English of the different segments of the population in South Africa make this a challenge, but also he advocates providing English education to a larger segment of the population to enable more people to participate in the global economy. Kawanga Malu cautions that the status of the vernacular in society is a crucial key to educational success. For instance, a school in Anglophone Africa used English as the medium of instruction throughout the entire educational system, while others use the indigenous language as an institutional medium for the first 3 years of primary education, and then transition to English medium instruction. However, in South Korea, English has become a critical part of education, and there has been a recent debate about making English as an official language of the country. Okay, English in Europe. English is a lingua franca throughout Europe, but what about the growing use of English in higher education programs? English is considered a threat to the survival of other languages in Europe, and its widespread use challenges the official EU policy on promoting linguistic diversity. As English is used in higher education programs, there is some speculation about the long-term effects of the increased use of English throughout Europe. Here we have House, who discusses how English as a lingua franca is spoken by multilinguals, as well as how it should be embraced as a hybrid variety that may include a diversity of worldviews. In some cases, the spread of English is equated with the spread of capitalism and consumerism. Philipson argues that the term lingua franca evokes a sense of egalitarianism that is not present in a situation in which some are native speakers and others are not, and the language is not neutral but linked to specific cultural traditions and influences. To conclude, linguistic inequality is embedded in education in its 3 different contexts. In cases where students speak non-standard dialects, in communities where minority languages are spoken, and in countries where English is not a community language but is the medium of education. So, social inequalities are perpetuated by ideologies which privilege certain ways of speaking, and social structures which impede access to high-status codes for some portions of the population.